There is a major shift happening, at least among the center and the center left in this country, about deficits, and a growing movement of people who call themselves modern monetary theory adherents who say we should stop worrying about the deficit altogether. How much influence is that having right now on this debate, and for you and Larry Summers, who in the past have talked about the debt, to come out and say, you know what, this perhaps requires a rethink of what has been a consensus in Washington?
You know, I think there's been a major change in the economy, and that's changed the way a lot of people and a lot of organizations think about the debt. You know, a place like the International Monetary Fund, which for decades pushed fiscal consolidation, pushed austerity, you know, is now pretty much off that and talking about how that can actually hurt economies. And so a lot of this just depends on where you are economically. That's changed, so our views on the deficit should change with it.
Well, is that going to be, but what is it going to sort of underpin an actual change in that view, and particularly put that into action, particularly when you consider that sort of the current interest rate cycle that we've been on over the past couple of decades might not necessarily be the same cycle that we're on in the next couple of decades going forward?
Right. You know, when the first President Bush and President Clinton were cutting the deficit, the real interest rate was about 4%. Businesses were not investing a lot. It was really important to get the deficit down, get interest rates down, and make it so businesses could afford to invest more. There's no businesses right now that aren't investing because they can't afford the cost of capital, because borrowing costs are too high. We don't need a big deficit reduction program to reduce interest rates that already, adjusted for inflation, are just a tiny bit above zero. So we're just, you know, in a very different position right now, and interest rates are the best measure of how different that position is.
You've talked about in your piece in particular large deficits arising from deriving more from falling revenues, really, than actual rising in spending. Jason, I want to get your take on how, therefore, we can more efficiently bring in revenues. Are any of the new speeches coming out from presidential hopefuls on the way to tax people ringing good chimes in your ears or not?
Yeah, first of all, you made an important point, or at least you quoted a point I made. I don't know if you endorsed it. That if we hadn't had the tax cuts of the last couple decades, we'd actually have a budget surplus right now, not a budget deficit. I think we will need more revenue over time. I think we can certainly afford to have higher rates. I'd love to focus on improving the tax base. On the corporate side, we could have expensing for businesses, which is a good thing for them, together with those higher rates. On the individual side, we could close a lot of the loopholes, a lot of the tax benefits high-income households get as the first way of getting money, you know, and then, you know, if that doesn't raise enough, raise rates. But, you know, I think all of this is the right direction to be talking about.
Jason, the exploding deficit we've seen in recent years hasn't pushed interest rates higher. Therefore, what's the evidence that the diminished deficits under the first George W. Bush and under President Clinton can take credit for the lower interest rates that they saw? After all, interest rates have been declining since the early 1980s. It looks on a chart like a just continuation of the trend. If the link is broken now, how do we know that that relationship held in the past?
Yeah. Oh, look, it may not have held in the past, so maybe this point was true 25 years ago. But there have been a set of studies about the impact of deficits on interest rates, both in the United States and elsewhere. They've been quite careful, and they find that a 1% of GDP deficit raises interest rates by about 25 basis points. I think it's reasonable to think something like that. And if you think something like that, you know, ask yourself, would we be better off right now if interest rates were 1.5 points lower? I think in some ways that would be, you know, a quite scary prospect when you think about what monetary policy would be like in a world with much lower interest rates, even lower than we have now.
Jason, is there any concern that if we were to sort of embark down this path, that it could sort of put in jeopardy the status of the dollar, and particularly the strength of the dollar, should the Treasury continue to increase its debt sales?
Yeah. Well, Larry and I argue we need a limiting principle. This isn't, you know, anything goes, you can do whatever you want, free lunch type of situation. We argue you should pay for things. That would actually be a change from the tax cuts that we did a year and a half ago. It would constrain the ambition of some of the Democratic plans that I think probably would be hard to pay for. It does say, though, you know, the existing deficit, the existing debt, they're going to keep trending up gradually. We're just not going to add a whole lot to it that would make it increase even faster.
What is the limiting principle?
You know, our limiting principle is pay-go. You know, I don't know if that would work forever. We'd have to check back 5 years from now where the deficit and debt are, where interest rates are. But I think for at least right now, not actively digging the hole any deeper, I think would be more than fine, would in some ways be an improvement on what we've seen lately, and would let us focus on other issues like, you know, employment, climate change, healthcare, you know, education, training, and the like.